Good morning, class. I'm happy to be here to present for another session.
Morning, Chief.
And I trust that you are more settled in the course thus far. And I hope that you are all ensuring that you remain focused and stay ahead so that you can finish strong on this course. So with that said, we are looking at trauma overview for this session, and it's another one of your fundamental chapters. And as Mr. Rufus told you before, you have to make sure you get these fundamental points because they are going to be the foundation building blocks as you go forward. So when we talk about trauma overview, we're going to be looking at trauma in general. And as you go through for the next couple of days, you'll be looking at individual and specific trauma emergencies. So you'll be looking at your head and spine injury, chest injuries, abdominal injuries, extremity injuries, and so forth. So as a healthcare provider, you will be called to scenes where patients are either sick or injured. And so from your knowledge of anatomy and physiology, you would have remembered that the body is made up of different systems, and with those systems you have organs that are located at different sections of the body. So it's important for us to remember that normally the body will maintain the normal functions unless there is some form of sickness, disease, illness, or injury. And that's when you will be called as a healthcare provider. That's when we talk about the pathology that you will have to deal with. So from your knowledge of patient assessment that you had covered, I'm assuming that you have covered patient assessment. Raise your hand if that's the case. Okay, so from your knowledge of patient assessment, thank you, you would have heard the term mechanism of injury and nature of illness. Mr. Johnson, tell me what you recall mechanism of injury is.
All right. The mechanism of injury is what is the most likely probable cause of what caused the injury to the patient. So whether if it's a wire them around the neck or them fall from a step or something like that, or even in a motor vehicle accident.
Okay, thank you. So normally the body will maintain its normal function until we say there is illness or injury. So aging process predispose us as human to have illnesses and diseases. So most of persons you will be called to attend to with sickness and illness will be the older population. And on the flip side of it also, younger population are more active. So they are the ones that are gonna be having these injuries. And so the slide tells that for people younger than age 44, traumatic injuries are the leading cause of death in the United States. And I would say also generally in the world, and also you could say that in Jamaica. So unless there is a pandemic as we have now, And even in the pandemic, we find older persons are more susceptible to illness or the virus. So when we look at the mechanism of injury, as you saw in patient assessment, when you do your scene size up, after you have ensured that the scene is safe and you are sure that you can go into that scene, then the next big item we will be looking at is the mechanism of injury or nature of illness. And as you said before, Mr. Johnson, mechanism of injury is trauma that has been done to the patient. So we are going to be looking at things on our patient. Is either it's going to be a trauma emergency or a medical emergency, but you will not have a tunnel vision and say it is either until you have done the assessment. So at all times you do your assessment and you will see what is the real situation, because a trauma emergency can occur from a medical emergency. And what do we mean by trauma emergency? It is when a force or energy has been applied to the body that the body cannot tolerate, and so it results in injury. And there you must remember the anatomy and physiology. The body has certain protective mechanism in place, but if the force or the energy is great enough, then it's going to overwhelm those protective mechanisms and injury will result. So these two terms you need to know: traumatic emergencies and medical emergencies. So for traumatic emergencies, it's when physical force has been applied to the body. And for the medical emergency, it's when there is illness or a condition not related to any outside force. So for a medical emergency, the person would have some natural illness, some sickness that they are suffering from, and so that would be a medical emergency. But you must remember, don't have a tunnel vision and go on a scene, even on a motor vehicle accident, and you see damage to the vehicle, you see the patient have injury, and then you're just going to assume that it's strictly a trauma-related incident. It could be that this person had a heart attack and they crash. They could have had a diabetic emergency where their sugar level go low and they crash. It could be that they had a seizure. So you have to do your assessment and then you can determine which it is which. So always, as we look trauma overview, again we'll be looking at it in general and make sure you get these fundamental, because you ride throughout this course and you'll be coming back to them when you are in the field. If you are hearing me clearly, you can raise your hand. Okay, thank you. Okay, so traumatic injuries may be caused by underlying medical or medical illnesses may result from traumatic injuries, and we spoke about that. As I said before, when you are doing your patient assessment in your scene size, you will look at mechanism of injury, which is very important as we are looking at trauma emergencies. So remember, the mechanism of injury is, as the word says, the mechanics of the injury. What caused the injury to that person? What are the forces that had applied to that person's body that has resulted in the injury? And from that mechanism of injury, which you must look at and determine, then you will have an index of suspicion as to what possible underlying injuries this person would have sustained. So you will see a person in a motor vehicle accident have injury to the chest. You must recognize that from your knowledge of anatomy and physiology, then the organs below that section of the chest can be injured also. So that's how important the mechanism of injury is. You must look at it because you will get valuable information to use in your assessment. and also you'll be taking the patient into the receiving facility, and you'll be calling in to give information on the patient. What you see out there is very important for you to relay that information to the receiving party, because we are eyes and ears out there for the physicians in the hospital. So we are to note what we see. And some companies, some agencies will allow you to take pictures, but then again, you have to follow your protocol. So we're reminded that the mechanism of injury is very important as you go in your assessment. So it's for us to recognize that. So when we look at mechanism of injury, we are talking about energy or of force inside to the body. So we need to know about energy. So the traumatic injury occurs when the body's tissues are exposed to energy levels beyond their tolerance. So we say the protective mechanism is overwhelmed, and so the injury occurred. So the mechanism of injury is the way the traumatic injury occurred. And so it is the forces that has acted upon the body resulting in the injury. So again, we must pay attention to this energy. What is this energy that is gonna act upon the body? And this is where we need to know about the different types of energy. So in looking at energy, we recognize that there are basically 3 forms of energy. So you will have potential energy, you will have kinetic energy, and then you are gonna have another form, which is the energy of work, or the working energy. So every substance or anything that has weight or mass will have potential energy. So we can say potential energy is basically the stored energy. So if the object start to fall, the potential energy will develop, and that potential energy, the product of the substance mass or weight times the distance it's falling through, and most importantly, gravity. So that will determine the potential energy that that object develops. So imagine you have your cell phone on the table. It is there, have the stored energy, the potential energy is there because it can fall. So if accidentally someone push that phone and it fall off the table, then it's gonna fall through a distance until it reach the ground. Now that's where the potential energy it develops based on its mass, the distance is falling through, and gravity. It's gonna turn from potential energy to kinetic energy. So what is kinetic energy? It's an energy related to a thing that is moving, and you need to know the formula. So the formula is half the mass times the velocity square. And so it's very important for us to recognize that the kinetic energy is related directly to the velocity or the speed of the object. So the faster the object is going, then the more kinetic energy it will have. We will look more at it, but just recognize that the kinetic energy is the energy that a substance possesses due to its movement or motion. And eventually, the phone was moving, potential energy become kinetic energy. Eventually, the kinetic energy is gonna become energy of work when that phone hits whatever surface is gonna hit and come to a stop. So the energy of work is the force exerted over a distance. And so let's say you had one of those old phone, the banger, and it hit the ground, and you will see that it shatter. So the kinetic energy is gonna be converted. So we say at the bottom there that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but can only be converted or transformed. So we see where the transformation is going on from stored energy, potential energy, as transformed into kinetic energy once this object or substance start to move, and eventually it's gonna stop, and so that kinetic energy will become energy of work or working energy. And so we say that working energy cannot be lost, cannot be destroyed, so it's gonna be transformed or converted into the sound you hear when the phone drop, and also the energy gonna transform into that phone being damaged. And so you see the banger will split into 3 different pieces. You see the battery one section, the shell, and the body of the phone another section. And luckily, most of the time you fit up back that banger and it's good to go again. But if it's your smartphone, you might not be so lucky. It's gonna be maybe irreparable damage. So that's the transformation of the energy. And we are gonna look at it as it relates to human in a motor vehicle accident, a person falling, and so the same energy, the same way the energy gonna be transformed into a person becoming injured. So as we look further at these in more detail, we will see the concept coming up, and you all should remember that there are 3 collisions in a motor vehicle accident, and also you need to know Newton's 3 laws. So as we look at the concept of energy, so Mr. Wilson, can you tell me what is the formula for kinetic energy?
Didn't catch that.
Okay, Mr. Manning, can you tell us what's the formula for kinetic?
Mine again. You said the formula for the kinetic energy.
Yes.
I don't quite remember, no, sorry. It's you mentioned half squared. I didn't get to jot it down.
Anyone else recall what I said about kinetic energy? What's the formula? Go ahead, Mr. Powell.
Half mass times velocity squared.
Everyone pay attention, because as I said, these are fundamental information you are getting, and you're gonna recall these as you go. Your trauma emergencies and throughout your life as a EMS provider, you need to recall these information because I'll be using it. So it's very important for you to know that formula, because when it comes on transfer of energy, kinetic energy into the work of energy, that formula is giving you crucial information, because based on the formula, if you double the mass or the weight of an object, let's say the car weight, you get a twice the size car, and you double that car, then kinetic energy will only be doubled. But if you increase the speed of a vehicle from 30 to 60 kilometers or miles per hour, then the kinetic energy not only doubles, it's gonna be 4 times. And so it is very important that we recognize this formula, because it shows us that the speed of the vehicle is what is directly related to the amount of kinetic energy that is gonna develop and will be converted to working energy to cause damage to the vehicle, and ultimately gonna cause damage and injury to the persons inside that vehicle. So make sure you retain that formula. So we say that the kinetic energy is gonna be transformed into working energy. So this is where you need to know also that work is force acting over distance. So this is the forces that is gonna bend, pull, or compress tissues beyond inherent limits, resulting in the work that causes the injury. So first, the motor vehicle accident, the vehicle is gonna collide in another vehicle or a pole or a wall. The kinetic energy gonna be transformed first into sound. You'll hear sound as the vehicle crash, and then it's gonna be transformed into energy to cause damage to the vehicle. And when we look at the collisions that I mentioned, you have 3 collisions. So you have first collision second collision and third collision. So the first collision is when that vehicle impact whatever it impacting to come to a stop. And that's where we say that kinetic energy will be converted to working energy and is gonna be transformed into sound. If the person had time to start applying the brake, then it's gonna be converted to heat, apply the brake. But most of the time, the person crash without even having time to apply the brake. So all that kinetic energy is gonna be transformed into sound energy and the work to damage the vehicle. And ultimately, we'll have the second collision where the person in that vehicle, whatever speed the vehicle is going at, the body inside the vehicle is going at the same speed. And so when the vehicle come to a stop from 30 to 0 kilometers or miles per hour within less than a second, then that same person is gonna be moving at the 30 and come to the stop same time. Then that kinetic energy the person possesses, because they are moving relative same way, they are gonna have that same kinetic energy transferred to their body. And the third collision is our organs in our body will be moving at the same speed that the vehicle was going at. It's gonna come to a stop same way whenever the vehicle stop. And so whenever it's come to a stop, organ in our body is gonna hit against the inside of our body. And that's the third collision. So we need to make sure that we know these three different types of collision that is happening. And it's all relative to what we know about kinetic energy. And we say the formula is half mass times velocity square. And you must recognize that the faster the thing going, it's the more kinetic energy it's gonna possess. And also we need to know Newton's 3 laws. So the first law states that an object at rest will remain at rest unless acted upon by a force. So as we said about the cell phone and the table, it was at rest and it would remain there until somebody move it or some force act upon it and it moves. The same thing. So if an object is in motion, also it's gonna remain in motion unless some force is acted upon it. So that's the principle you need to recognize, and it's gonna be what gives rise to that kinetic energy. And so the kinetic energy is not, because it says that an object will remain in motion. So if the vehicle is and it don't come to us, nothing is wrong. The kinetic energy is there and it won't cause any damage or injury. But it's when that vehicle come to a stop, and not only the fact that it come to a stop, but how it come to a stop. So if you are going at 30 and you come to 0 within less than a second, then that all of it gonna be transferred into working energy to cause damage to the vehicle and ultimately to the persons. But if the person is driving as we normally do and you want to stop and you slow down gradually, then you are gonna be slowing down, coming to a stop over a longer period, and so that working energy now become transformed into the brake in energy, which is the heat and friction. And so by the time you come to a stop, there is not much more kinetic energy to cause any great work to damage us or the vehicle. So that's the key thing we need to recognize. It's not about the kinetic energy per se, but is when you're gonna be changing velocity or speed. If the time is not sufficient, then that kinetic energy is gonna become working energy, which will cause damage if it's not done properly. So make sure we understand these concepts. So the working energy is gonna become the force that is gonna be causing those bending and tearing, and just as it damages the vehicle, is the same way it's gonna apply to our bodies and cause injury. So make sure we understand those concepts. So there you go. So Mr. Tyrell, what we say is work. What's the formula for work? Or you explain work? Mr. Tyrrell?
Yeah, work is a force acting over a distance.
Okay, thank you. So we say that the potential energy is the product of mass, force of gravity, and height. And we said that already, it's associated to objects that are falling. So we can say that it's the stored energy, but it's gonna be converted as the object fall, and so it's developed from the mass and the height. So just as our speed of is directly related to the kinetic energy that it's gonna possess. Faster the vehicle is going, 4 times if you double it, you're gonna get out for the kinetic energy. It's the same thing with the height that the object is falling from. The greater the height, then it is more kinetic energy is gonna be developing from the potential energy. So make sure you understand that concept as we go further to look at the injuries. Okay, so we spoke about the mechanism of injury already, and I said it's very important that you make sure you determine the mechanism of injury whenever you go on a scene. So from your patient assessment, it's the second thing you are gonna do in the first part of your assessment. So you are gonna do a scene size up on every scene you go on, and the first thing is to ensure that the scene is safe. Once the scene is safe, then the next item is your termination of the mechanism of injury or nature of illness. So that's a big item. You must look at the mechanism of injury if you are looking at a scene where trauma is involved. Very important. So different mechanism of injury will produce different types of injuries. And if you have a significant mechanism of injury, this is where the body will most likely have multi-system trauma. So with a significant mechanism of injury, meaning that a great force, significant force or energy has been applied to the body, then we know that many of the body systems can be overwhelmed. All of the protective mechanisms can be overwhelmed depending on where the energy or force is applied. And so just by looking at the mechanism of injury, you're gonna assume that serious injuries could have been applied to the person. So you go on a motor vehicle accident scene, you're gonna be looking at the damage to the vehicle. That's what we say comes from the first collision. So if you see excessive damage to that vehicle, then even without anybody telling you what speed that vehicle was coming at, you know that for a vehicle to have sustained significant damage, then the kinetic energy must have been great to transfer to working energy to cause that amount of damage. And so you're gonna tell yourself that everybody in that vehicle would have been exposed to that same amount of kinetic energy that caused damage to the vehicle, and so they can sustain injuries just the same based on that principle. So with a non-significant injury, normally it would be an isolated body part or fall which is not significant. So the main thing you need to recognize that with a significant mechanism of injury, multi-system trauma is highly likely, and so you have to think the worst. In our field as EMS providers in the pre-hospital settings, we don't have any x-ray machine to go and do any x-ray. So anything that happens, we are gonna think the worst case scenario and treat the patient accordingly until we know otherwise, or take them in and they will determine that in the hospital settings. So this is where we're gonna look at our mechanism of injury as a guide to help us. As it says earlier on, it's an index of suspicion that you get from the mechanism of injury. So very important for you to remember that. So mechanism of injury can come in basically 2 forms. So it can either be, all right, let's look at the significant injuries. So here we see what injuries we would consider as significant, and that would be coming from a significant mechanism of injury, which would give rise to these type of injuries. So you can have injury to more than one body system, multi-system trauma. You can have falls from heights, and let us talk about the height now. For an adult, a significant fall would be a height greater than 20 feet, and you can use this guide to estimate the height by saying that one floor or a story building is 10 feet. So if a person falls from 2 floors, then that's a significant mechanism of injury. That's a significant injury they can sustain. For a child, it is anything over 10 feet. Once it's 10 feet or more for the child, we are going to say that's a significant mechanism of injury. It can sustain significant injuries. Motor vehicle and motorcycle crashes. These, we're looking at a speed of over 20 miles per hour. In that range, we are going to say that's a significant mechanism of injury. Significant injuries can result from it. Car versus pedestrian or bicycle, that's another significant mechanism of injury. Suspect that they can have multi-system trauma. All of these, you're going to suspect spinal injury and take that precaution. If it's a gunshot wound, again, if it's not a isolated, go ahead, Mr. Manning.
Yes, sir. Yes, not to interrupt. When you said the motor vehicle crashes, I didn't catch how fast you said it. You said 20 miles per hour. It was breaking a little bit.
Yes. So
Oh,
over 20 miles per hour, that's what they are gonna lean on to say that's a significant crash. So
okay.
remember we said that the formula kinetic energy is half mass times velocity squared. So anything over 20 miles per hour is gonna be considered significant. So for a gunshot wound, we say also that if it's an isolated body part, then it's not significant. So if a person get a gunshot wound in the, say in the hand, a serious injury, yes, but not saying that it's significant in that sense. So you just focus on the injury, but still do your general assessment of the patient. So in all cases, you gotta do your ABCs, rule out any life threat, because even though we say it's an isolated injury, the person can have, like we said, medical issues and can be compromised in any way. So you're always gonna check the person's ABCs and then you're gonna focus on that isolated injury. But in terms of the injury itself, they are gonna class that as a non-significant. But for significant, it would be multi-system trauma, and also we're gonna look at the caliber of the weapon and the that's gonna be related to the significance of it also. Or just an isolated extremity injury, which is not really significant. Stabbing cases, and we don't know where the exact part where are the instrument that was used to cause the stabbing. So again, it can be significant. So we'd call those significant. But in general, if you have a penetrating injury to your head, neck, chest, abdomen, those are significant mechanism of injury. So just remember that also. So as we look at the mechanism of injury, it is very important that we recognize what are the forces that has been applied to the body, and also recognize that the potential is there for a significant injury just based on that mechanism of injury. So they are gonna categorize the trauma in 2 types. So you can refer to it as blunt trauma or penetrating trauma. And so we need to know the difference. So with a blunt trauma, it's the result of force to the body that causes injury without penetrating the soft tissues. So some force has been applied to the body. The force is applied in such a way that it applied to a broad contact to the body. And so normally the skin is not broken, but the danger with a blunt trauma is that underlying organs and structures can be damaged and can also lead to severe internal bleeding. So that's the danger with a blunt trauma. So you'll see somebody with just a contusion on the chest, and you're gonna look at it and say, well, that's not significant. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, Chief. Yes, Chief. Yes, Chief. Yes, Chief. Yes, Chief. Over my mic. Yes, sir.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. With the
It didn't come through clearly, Mr. Johnson.
You hear me now, sir?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So you see blunt force trauma and penetrating trauma. So, say for instance, you have a wedge heel and a skeletal heel, right? You hear me, boss?
You said a wedge heel. Repeat what you said about the heel.
Wedge heel. Female shoes.
Yes, yes.
Right. And suppose a female use the wedge heel for lift a man or a woman, right? Between the wedge heel and the skeletus, which one would apply more force to cause a greater trauma to the person?
All right. So with a penetrating injury, we are looking at the size of the object that is causing the injury, the velocity or speed at which it is moving, and also the area of the body that it is impacting. So those three characteristics will decide or determine the amount of injury that the person sustained. So it's hard for us to say the amount of force. You're not really focusing on the amount of the force that is going to be applied, but we are going to look at the resulting injury that is possible. And so, as I said before, it's hard for us to tell exactly where the instrument could have gone in the body. So the fact remains that you're going to use the size of the object, the force at which the person is using it at, and also the area of the body that is impacting, and that you're going to use as your guide. So the mechanism of injury you're going to look at is that injury to the body could be, you have penetrating and also some blunt force going to be involved. So you're going to suspect that from that, it's likely wherever the body and the body that's as impacted, that you're going to have external injury. So you're going to have a penetrating wound. You're going to maybe have signs of contusion around that area. But ultimately, what is happening inside, we can know and see. And that is why you're going to look at where the object hit, and from your knowledge of anatomy and physiology, then you should know what organs are below that region and suspect that any and all of them could have been injured in the process. So that's what should be our focus. So not to say you're going to try to calculate the force, but just to know that the force has been applied, and it's either going to be penetrating, where you'll see a penetrating wound, and you know that based on the size of the object, so if it's a shoe, you will see the length of the shoe if it has been removed. If it's still impaled, then we're not going to remove it unless it's obstructing the airway or so forth. That's answer your question.
Yes, sir. But where me should hello? No, don't use your mic.
Yes, Chief. That answers your question.
Okay. Yeah, please mute the mic. Okay, so it's very important for us when you're looking at the mechanism of injury to recognize that it can take either form, blunt force, or it's going to be penetrating trauma. And what we need to recognize, if it's a blunt force, so a person in a motor vehicle accident and the chest impact the steering wheel, or if you want to call it the other way, so the steering wheel impact the chest. But there is that example. So most of our blunt force, most motor vehicle accident, you're going to have blunt force trauma to the body. And so that's what's going to happen. It's a broad area of contact with the steering wheel to the chest. So usually or normally you not see a exposed tissue or the skin is not broken, but the danger with it is underlying organ would have been exposed to the force, which we say you can work out from kinetic energy that would have been developed and transferred to working energy, which damaged the vehicle first, and then the same force you said gonna occur to the person from the second collision. Their body is gonna impact wherever in the vehicle, and so that blood force gonna cause internal or can cause internal damage, which we cannot see, but you're gonna maybe notice signs and symptoms from the patient, which indicate to you that something is happening there. But your index of suspicion must be high to tell you that just from the mechanism of injury and the sign that you see that the person have contusion to the chest, you must know that that is not a light injury because of the impact that you see to the vehicle from the first collision. So that's the danger. No risk of contamination normally because the skin is not broken, but the danger is underlying organ can and will be damaged, and risk is there for severe internal bleeding. With a penetrating trauma, the point of contact of the object to the body is at a small point of contact. So usually you're gonna have the skin broken. There is penetration of the body from that object, and there are very many risks with that one. You're gonna have external bleeding possible, risk of contamination, but also serious damage can be done to underlying organ, internal organ, which also give rise to severe internal bleeding. So these are the things you must be considering and looking at as you do your assessment. So recognize also that either type may occur from a variety of mechanisms of injury. So mechanism of injury class is very, very significant, and you must assess it whenever you go on a scene where you recognize that trauma is involved. You cannot overlook the mechanism of injury. A lot of times we are, go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, sir. Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
All right. So it all comes back down to proper scene size up and mechanism of injuries assessment when you are dealing with trauma. Because enough time we have MPA and the whole scene size up and primary assessment wasn't done correctly, and even sometimes when these persons are transported to the hospitals, sometimes people still don't do a proper secondary assessment. Right? Because me lost a good friend that way there, I'm up to today. I try to ensure say I try to do my thing the correct way.
That's very good, Mr. Johnson.
The man had 2 broken ribs and internal damage where he was bleeding on the inside. And the hospital never picked up that until 4 days after the man admit after the accident. So the man inside start decompose.
Yes, and that is very much what will happen and can happen, and that's why we are doing this training. So as I said, it's very important that we make sure that we are doing the proper thing, and it's very important that when you look at your patient assessment, you are doing it correctly. And it is a learning experience, and as Mr. Rufus told you guys before, all of you would come with your prior experience and knowledge, and he has asked you to make sure you come with an open mind so that you can be taught the proper things and you will retain it and practice it going forward. So these are the things that we know is happening, and this is why you are doing this course, so you are getting the proper way. And even sometimes persons are taught the right thing, but when they go out there, they divert from it for whatever reason. That's another class basically. But recognize that we are focusing on trauma overview. We are getting the general principles and fundamental of trauma, which is going to guide you as you go into your trauma emergencies for this course and right throughout your lifetime as a EMS provider. You're going to be using this information. So it's very important that you get this concept and stay with it and use it as you go along. So it says that blunt trauma results from an object making contact with the body. As we said, motor vehicle crashes and falls are the most common MOIs, and you must be alert to skin discoloration and pain. So recognize that you see a discoloration, and Mr. Cameron, what's a name for this skin discoloration?
Cyanosis. You hear me, sir?
You said cyanosis?
Yes, sir.
Not in that sense. What's another name? Skin discoloration.
No.
We don't normally say cyanosis is a skin discoloration. We would say it's an abnormal skin color. Here's another word you would know. Skin discoloration. Anyone term from trauma, and you're gonna see skin. What skin discoloration and what is the name for another name for? Go ahead, Mr. Wilson.
Contusion.
Very good. So if you see the word or bruise, ikimo, that's what it is. And you're gonna see that coming up in. So make sure you know, if you see contusion, if you see bruise, if you see ikimo, it's referring to the same thing. It's a skin discoloration that is telling you that there is bleeding going on under the skin. And that is what you're gonna look at to that this indicating to you that some force has been applied to the, and this is where it's more than likely a blow. The skin is not broken, so you don't see any laceration. And you might say, well, that's nothing, but you must go back to your MOI. What is a motor is the most common force trauma? What was the injury damages to the vehicle? That is your index of suspicion that this person, even though he's showing you just a discoloration and the chest area, tell yourself that underlying organs can be damaged. You can have fracture, you contusion, you can laceration, you can have internal bleeding, and so you have to be mindful. You don't overlook, and that's why they are telling you be alert once you see that, because it's indicating to you that underlying organ can be damaged. So maintain a high index of suspicion for hidden injuries. And what are you gonna get this? Where are you gonna get this high index of suspicion from? It's from your mechanism of injury. So it's very important that you always get that mechanism of injury. No matter how you go on a scene and you see everything look awful and you just gonna think about rushing into that scene and just start patient care. Step back and just observe a little. Make sure you get that mechanism of injury. And you need that as a guide to help you as you go about your assessment. And as I said, a lot. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
So with the confusion, sir. So if you go on the MPA scheme, right? One
Yes, Mr. Johnson.
a motor vehicle that where the steering would impact the person in a sternum or the earbud would have maybe nick him in the head. That give some form of impression, say some kind of force was acting up on the body in the second collision while that gave that sign.
Yes.
Okay.
So that was your statement, Mr. Johnson.
Repeat that, sir. Now I hear something.
No, I am asking if you were just making a statement that once the steering impact the chest, then you will have that contusion, which gives you an index of suspicion.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, man. So that's what I'm saying. That's quite correct. So also if you have the time, you should also observe inside of the vehicle to see those damage that are done inside the vehicle, because wherever damage is, then it's showing or suggesting to you that the patient would have impacted those areas. And wherever damage done, we say from Newton's third law that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if you see damage steering, then it's suggesting that the patient had an opposing force to their chest or wherever hit that steering. And so you must have that index of suspicion that damage is done to that patient in that area also. And again, I said some agency will allow you to take pictures, but remember, it comes down to the patient privacy. Remember the people ruling that patient confidential information must be kept as such, only related to the relevant person. So you don't want to take a picture of a crash scene and later on you see it on public social media. You can be found responsible and sued for it. So remember, follow your protocol. Some companies might give you a phone that they wanted to use, or if they use your phone, then remember also, if it's a shooting incident you go to and you go take a picture, your phone can be subpoenaed and you will lose your phone until investigation over. So you must take all those things into consideration. But it's very important that we can recognize the mechanism of injury. And as I said, you are the eyes and ears out there for the physician. So when you take that patient in, if you can give them that impression, and with nowadays technology, you will have some agencies that you can relay that information, if it's a photo or right away upload it to them, and they can see it and they can appreciate more better than us as to what they suspect is happening to that patient. Got another question, Mr. Johnson? Your hand still up, Mr. Johnson?
Oh, it's never come out.
Okay, so as we look at vehicle crashes, so we said that the blunt trauma gonna come a lot from the motor vehicle crashes. All right, so it's very important that we recognize that there are 5 classes of motor vehicle crashes. So it's either gonna be frontal, rear end, lateral, rollovers, rotational. And principal difference with all of these different classes of vehicular crashes is that the direction of the force of impact. So with a frontal impact, the force is gonna come, as it suggests, from the front. Rear end is gonna come from the rear, lateral from the head. Rollover is gonna be coming from all over, and that's the danger with rollover. You're gonna have forces come or can come from all different points. So that's one of the most significant crashes, rollover. And rotational is almost similar to rollover, except that is gonna be impacting all different sides also. You need to recognize the type of crash, have your index of based on what you know as the mechanism of injury. And so you have certain injuries that are, you could say, specific more with each of them. And so we need to look at those. But as an overview, if you have a frontal crash, then from what we know about the first collision, the kinetic energy will be transferred into working energy. You'll have sound energy. You're gonna have force applied to cause damage to the vehicle. And so the same thing in the second collision, the person inside the vehicle gonna be moving at the same speed until their body is gonna come to a stop wherever it's gonna impact inside the vehicle, and they're gonna likely to have injuries. So with a frontal crash, the person can either have head injuries, neck injuries, chest injuries, abdominal injuries, pelvic injuries, lower extremity injuries, and you're gonna have it in two forms that gonna cause it. When a person involved in a motor vehicle accident, they can either go what we call down and under, or they can go up and over. So if the person go down and under, it is saying that they're gonna hit their knee against the dashboard. They can also hit their abdomen against the lower part of the steering. And so hitting their knee against the dashboard can have damage to the knee, but also we talk about resultant forces that they can indirectly transfer along the femur and can have pelvic injury. So those are injuries you're going to look at. And I said before, the abdomen can come in contact with the lower part of the steering. And so those are the injuries you get from the down and under. And usually why a person go down and under is if the seat belt is not fitted properly or they don't have on any seat belt. So they can also go up and over, and in that way now the chest can impact the steering, and afterward or ultimately their head can impact the roof or the windscreen. So you're gonna see sometimes spiderweb windscreen, then you are going to assume that the person's head hit, somebody head hit the windscreen. And if you see the damage to the windscreen, then that person can have ultimately damage to their head. Even if they don't have an external damage to their head, third collision gonna come into play, where the organ inside the body, the brain gonna be moving at the same speed, and it's gonna move until we say Newton's first law says it's gonna come to rest when some force acts upon it and will crash against your skull. And so you're gonna have what we call compression injury to the front of the brain, and also tearing to the posterior region of the brain. That's what we call coup contra coup. So an injury opposite part of the organ, and that's what is likely. So these are some what you call classic injuries that you can have from the frontal crash. With a rear end crash, we are looking at whiplash. So you will hear whiplash coming up when a person have a rear end. So when the force applied to the rear of the vehicle, we say that the work is working energy transfer damage the vehicle, and also the person also gonna be moving forward, but their head and neck gonna be lagging behind. And so worse if they don't have any seat rest or head rest, then the head and neck can be whipped back further, and that is what gonna cause the whiplash. So that's one of the classic injuries you're gonna have. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, sir. So that's why they always tell you, so you must sit upright and your headrest in the vehicle supposed to be more than 2 inches or so away from your head when you sit down, to prevent the whole heap of force if you collide with the vehicle.
Definitely. So it's very important that your seat, your headrest is positioned properly. And the guiding thing, there's I think some people tell that it should be, top of it should be in line with your ear. So it shouldn't be too high and it shouldn't be too low. So ideally, I want to have it at that spot that will prevent that backward movement of the head and neck, which is gonna result in whiplash. So also for the frontal crash, remember that from your second collision, if we say that if the person or the vehicle slow down gradually, the kinetic energy that is left to cause damage will be significantly less. So what the seatbelt is gonna do also is keep you colliding with the dashboard or the steering or the windscreen for a longer period before you make that contact. So it will allow that kinetic energy to dissipate further, so that time you eventually reach those points, then you won't there will not be so much force to be exerted on your body. So that's how the seatbelt helps. A lot of persons don't like seatbelt, but it's more beneficial to have the seatbelt on properly and not to have it any at all. So, and also the airbag's gonna come into play also. It's gonna slow you down from reaching to that point where you impact the steering or the dashboard or the windscreen also, but it make you have a broader point of contact. We talk about blunt trauma as against penetrating trauma. So imagine you're gonna hit the steering wheel at a narrow point of contact. If you have the airbag deployed, then it's gonna cushion your body at a broader point of contact, and so it's gonna dissipate the force over a wider area. So ultimately, the injury will be less. You can look at the analogy if you should stand on a block or a section of ice. Usually it's gonna break, but if you lie flat on that square of ice, more than likely it will not break because you're exerting a wider point of contact. So the force against you or against the ice will occur at a broader area and dissipate that force. So depending on the condition, maybe the ice don't break. So it's the same analogy with the airbag. It's gonna cause the force to be applied at a broader point of contact on your body, and so it will reduce the force applied on your body and lessen the injury that you can sustain. Saying that, you must recognize also that you can still get some injury from even having on the seat belt, still get injury from the airbag, but what we are talking about is the severity of the injury should and will be lessened when you are using these things properly. And also remember that when you go to that motor vehicle accident scene, be mindful that if the airbag wasn't deployed during the crash, when you are treating that patient, remember that it can deploy when you treating that patient. So that's another safety consideration. When you're looking at safety, you have to take that in mind, into consideration. And usually we'll say that we detach the battery terminal, but even if you take off the battery terminal, the airbags are such manufactured, they are made that way that they can still be deployed even with the battery terminal off. So you have to bear that in mind. You have that situation awareness as to your safety when it regarding that. So here we see a frontal collision. So a crash consists of 3 collisions, and I've mentioned them before, but collision number 1 is the car against another car, tree, or object. So whatever the vehicle coming collision collides with, that is gonna be your first collision, and that is gonna be as a result of the kinetic energy that it possesses due to its motion. And we say that the greater the speed, the more significant the kinetic energy, and it's gonna be transferred into working energy. It's gonna be transferred into sound when you have that loud impact from the crash, and also the force that is gonna be used to cause all those damage that you see, bending, tearing, bashing of the vehicle. That's the energy. Because the energy cannot be destroyed. Without destroying it, it's been transferred into some other form of energy, and that is what causes damage to the vehicle. And ultimately, the person inside will be impacted from that second collision, where their body going at the same speed, having their own kinetic energy, gonna be coming to a stop from Newton's first law when a force is acted upon them, and that's when they collide with wherever they collide inside of the vehicle. So by assessing the vehicle, you can often determine the MOI. So you are gonna see the external damage. You have that as an index of suspicion. You see severe damage, we know that that's a significant. We say any crash over 20 miles per hour is gonna be considered significant. So you have that index of suspicion from the extensive damage to the vehicle. Then you will see spiderweb windscreen, suspect that the person inside would have hit it. You go in and look inside the vehicle. Again, a lot of times we don't have enough time, or we don't really focus on that. But by right, we should be looking inside of the vehicle also and noting these damage that is done inside the vehicle. That's what we're gonna use as our mechanism of injury also, to see where damage that tells you that somebody inside hit against it, and that is the force that's gonna be exerted on the body. Also, the same force that caused the damage to the steering wheel, damage to the windscreen, we see that Newton's third law said there's an opposite reaction, and it's gonna ultimately react back on the person's body and can cause similar injury. And also internal injury, also from the second collision and also from third collision, which we say that the organ inside of our body will be moving at the same speed, and so they come into contact. They're gonna stop when they hit against the inside of our body. So your heart is gonna be moving, you're gonna be coming against the chest cavity. You can have tearing, contusion, all sort of injury that are gonna occur inside. Great vessels gonna get damaged, can get damaged. All of those things can happen. So very important that you look at your mechanism of injury. You must have that index of suspicion from it. So if you don't look at it, you're not gonna have the index of suspicion. And then again, you're gonna come back to your knowledge of your anatomy and physiology. That's why I said that was a very fundamental topic. You have to know it, because you're gonna need all of that knowledge as you go through your assessment. So that's your first collision, crash of the vehicle against whatever object it comes in contact with. And for the second collision, we say that it's the passenger against the interior of the car. So common passenger injuries include lower extremity fracture, frail chest, and head trauma. So we say that lower extremity, when the person go down and under, and so they are gonna be impacting the knee hit the dashboard, and also you can have up and over, where the person chest hit the steering wheel, and also their head can hit the roof or the windscreen. So very important that you look at that MOI. Can't overlook it. So for the third collision we say is when the passenger's internal organs come in contact with the body inside cavity and result in injury. So here we see for the head hit the windscreen, and there we're gonna see the injury, that compression of the brain against the frontal lobe, and the posterior part of the brain is gonna be pulled away from the occipital lobe, and so you have tearing. So compression injury at the front, tearing injury at the posterior region, and that is what we call coup contra coup, because you have opposing injury and the body structure, and that is as a result of your third collision. So internal injuries may not be as obvious as external injury, but are often the most life-threatening, and that is where most of the time we're gonna overlook it. So you have a motor vehicle accident, and you go on the scene and you see persons walking around and you see severely damaged vehicle. You should have that index of suspicion from the damage to the vehicle. That should tell you that all of those persons inside that vehicle were exposed to that same kinetic energy, and they can have, even though you might not see any external injury on them, you must tell yourself that they can have the same brain injury here. They can have damage to their lungs, they can have damage to their heart, and they can have internal bleeding. And a lot of times, sometimes it happens, a person survive from an accident and go home, and next day that they died or they have to be in hospital. So you must have that index of suspicion and take necessary precaution. And in cases like those, you would have to do a standing takedown. Once it's recognized as a significant mechanism of injury, even though the person say I'm all right, you know better, and you should encourage them that we need to take you in and we need to protect your spine and suspect spinal injury. So you do a standing takedown, as you will. Well, I guess some of you would have known about that, but you will go more into that. So very important that you look at the MOI and consider these three collisions as we are looking at vehicular crashes, which you say is the main form of blunt trauma. So we're looking at significant mechanism of injuries again. We looked at some before. So it is saying here that significant mechanism of injury include the following findings. Death of an occupant in the vehicle. So any scene you go on and a person died in the vehicle, you are going to tell yourselves that everybody else in that vehicle would have been exposed to the same force that caused that person to die. So you must take necessary precaution. Even if you don't see any injury on them, you know that they can have internal injury. You must take the necessary spinal precaution is a must. Then you must go through, follow with your assessment. Severe deformity of the vehicle or intrusion into vehicle. So what we are saying, you see significant damage to the vehicle, tell yourself that the persons who have been exposed to that same degree of kinetic energy, same working energy that caused that damage would have caused injury to them and can cause injury to them also. Intrusion into the vehicle, you see a section of the vehicle, especially with lateral impact, or even the same frontal impact, but more so with lateral. As the side of the vehicle going, they say once it's going more than a foot, consider that is very significant, because wherever the person was positioned in the vehicle, if they were sitting on the same side that is the intrusion occur, then forces would have been applied to them. And we say with a lateral impact, you can have, just like how you have whiplash from rear end impact, the lateral impact can cause side whiplash also. So the body will be moving sideways, the head will be lagging behind, and you can have whiplash and damage to that section of the body all the way down from the head right down to the lower extremity and that side. So it's very important that you look at the mechanism of injury, and this is what they are saying. These are significant. Once you know these, consider that the person inside can have multi-system trauma. So severe damage from the rear. So wherever the severe damage is, front, rear side, it's a significant. Roof, anywhere, because that force would have been extended to the patient, the person's inside. So crashes in which rotation is involved, and we say this is another big potential for significant injuries, rotation and roll. So ejection from the vehicle. Once there's an ejection, then that's a significant mechanism of injury, because with that ejection, the person could have sustained injury inside the vehicle, and also when they are ejected, they are gonna be sustaining injury moving out of the vehicle, and also whenever they land, they're gonna be sustaining more injury. So great potential for significant injury, and so you must recognize these just by looking at your mechanism of injury. Suspect the worst and treat accordingly until you know otherwise. So you cannot overemphasize the need for assessment of your mechanism of injury. So, Miss Wellington, what we say is blunt trauma. Miss Wellington, what is blunt trauma?
Sir? Are you hearing me, sir?
Yes, I'm hearing you. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, Miss Wellington, I'm hearing you.
Trauma, sir, is blunt trauma is any to the does not penetrate the soft tissue.
So what are your concerns, Miss Wellington, with a blunt force trauma?
My concerns would be, sir, that because it doesn't penetrate the soft tissues, you are not able to really know the extent of the injury. So you have to make sure, sir, that you do your assessment, sir, in order to know how to treat accordingly.
So before you even go to your treatment, what's gonna be your index of suspicion if you observe there's blunt force trauma to the chest? What are your index of suspicion? That's
sir,
what we say.
In that case like that, sir, my suspicion would be that the person can have an injury that cannot be seen to the naked eye.
Okay, right, so very good. Okay, penetrating trauma. Mr. Tyrrell, explain penetrating trauma to me from your knowledge.
They caused by object that pierce and penetrate the surface of the body.
So what's your concern with a penetrating trauma?
There might be internal bleeding.
And what else? What else are you concerned about?
Shock.
Okay. Anything else? Penetrating trauma. What else are you concerned? You said internal bleeding. You said shock. You said
Death of the injury.
penetrating injury. What else?
Death of the injury, sir.
Okay.
And internal organs.
Okay. So if the skin is broken, what else you'd have?
Confusion.
You can, but not necessarily. Penetrating, what else? So you mentioned internal bleeding. So what about external bleeding?
Yes, sir.
So that's gonna be a big item with penetrating injury, the likelihood for external bleeding, and we are gonna always be concerned more about the control of the bleeding than even the contamination. You will try in your control of the bleeding to deal with the contamination, but more so in the pre-hospital setting, we are gonna control. So bear that in mind. So it's what type of injuries you would expect from a frontal collision, Mr. Papers? Did I get the name correctly?
CFAS. CFAS.
Oh, good morning. The question was what injuries am I expecting from a frontal collision?
That's correct.
Head injuries, because you could, bash your head in the windshield. Head injuries, chest injuries. Sure.
Anyone else? Any more injuries? More chest and head injury, just suspect frontal.
Neck and spinal.
Anything else? Front collision, significant damage to the front of the vehicle. What other injuries are you gonna suspect? Likely. Okay, go ahead. Mr. Manning, you're gonna finish up?
Yes, sir. You can also sustain knee injury, an injury to the abdomen, in the event the knee hits the dashboard.
And what and also pelvic. And what would say normally is the reason for that to happen? What would be the movement called?
It's a knee under. Did I get that right?
Down and under.
Down and under. Sorry.
So either the person gonna move down and under or up and over. So down and under, you will more to get lower extremity injury, pelvic injury, abdominal injury. Up and over, you're more likely to get chest injury and head injury, neck injuries. So bear that in mind. So can lower. Okay. So as we continue to look, go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, sir. With the over under, right?
No, up and over, up and over, down and under.
Right, down and under. Sorry. The damage to the pelvic and the femur with the position of the person foot while sitting down in the vehicle. You would determine where based on the confusion or where the pain where swelling, you would know where you would have sustained the injury from the collision.
Okay, so
May result a bilateral trauma to both femur if the person in the front of the vehicle, because the knee when bunks up on the dashboard that transfer that pressure or force back to the femur, and pressure always look a weak point to escape, which maybe I know they look out bone them there in the pelvis.
That's correct, Mr. Johnson. But remember, you are gonna look at your mechanism of injury from the first collision, and you'd have seen damage to the vehicle. So from that damage, you're gonna assume the worst and say that these persons in the vehicle can have significant trauma to the body. Then you're gonna go towards the person, or you're gonna look inside the vehicle. You're gonna maybe notice that the dashboard damage. So you're gonna tell yourself, no, that index of suspicion that somebody knee hit the dashboard. So it is likely you're gonna think the worst again and say that they can have all these damage to the knee, damage to the femur, damage to the pelvic. So you're gonna suspect that. Then you're gonna be assessing your patient now, and you're gonna go through your ABCs first, LOCBCs all the time. Treat any life threat. If it's a life-threatening situation, you might have to rapidly remove that patient from the vehicle and continue your assessment outside. If the patient is stable, then you consider using your KED to get that person. But you're gonna do eventually a rapid scan if it's a significant mechanism of injury, meaning you're gonna search the body. During that head to toe, you would have discovered these injuries that you would have suspected, and you treat them accordingly. So that is gonna be the approach. That's how you look at it. But you're gonna use your mechanism of injury first to give you an index of suspicion, and then that index of suspicion gonna guide you as you go through your assessment. So think the worst, and then you will assess and treat accordingly. All right, Mr. Johnson.
So with all of that said, sir, so your science is up, and yes, you said you're gonna need some extra resources and equipment now to move the patient from the collision.
So that would have been determined from your scene size up. Remember, I'm focusing on the trauma overview, so you would have covered those in your patient assessment, but I'm just picking out trauma part of it. But overall, that would have been done. You must do your scene size up, which would have included all of those things. So you should be telling me now that first thing you're gonna do on any scene that you go to is what? Mr. Johnson, what's the first thing you would do on any scene from what you did?
The scene safe. Be yourself first and foremost, because you don't end up being a casualty.
Okay.
And then the person will go fail.
Okay, so from that ensuring of the scene safety, you would have maybe have to call for additional resources from right there. If you see down power line, you'd have to call for JPS. If you notice that there is fire, you would have to call the fire department. If you notice that there is entrapped, maybe the same fire department would have to come in the excavation team. So that would have been determined from way up there, and as you go along, by the time you finish your scene size up, ensure the scene is safe first. Is that you can get it safe, somebody come get it safe for you, or you have to wait until that is done. Once it is safe, you're gonna go to your mechanism of injury, which you are focusing on now, a trauma, or you're gonna look at nature of illness. Once you have established that, that's what we're saying, you're gonna determine. So you must look at the MOI as it relates to trauma. Or you'd have maybe called for some other resources already to deal with what you have to deal. That's the whole purpose of scene size up, is to first determine if this scene is safe for me to go into it. Secondly, do I have enough resources to deal with it? And then thirdly, if I'm protected enough to go into it. That's the whole point of scene size. So you would have called for whatever resources you need to ensure the scene is safe. And by the time you finish scene safety, determine your MOI, which we're focusing on now, or your NOI, then you'd have gone to have the necessary precaution that you need, standard precaution, that's your PPE. Then you determine how many patients you have, and then you would have to maybe call for additional resources from the number of patients. So if you have a masculinity scene, you go there with your one ambulance, you cannot deal with it, so you'd have to call for backup from right there. You might be calling for ALS advanced team. In Jamaica setting, you might not advance to come unless the agency you're working with maybe send the medical director to help you. But as far as I know, you have official ALS, so ALS will have to provide at the hospital. So that is where we will go further down. You were talking about the platinum 10 minutes that you have to take care of persons who have significant multi-system trauma. 10 minutes stop, you have to stay on the scene. So finally, at the end of scene size up, you would have determined if you need any additional resources from all that I've seen and that scene now. You as a team leader or whoever have to make that decision. I have enough resources. If I don't have enough, then you have to call for everything right there. Because once you leave the scene size up, the next heading you're gonna go is primary assessment, where you're gonna be dealing with the patient now. Once you see the patient, you don't have much time for a call for backup again. So all this backup must be done up in your scene size. All right, so we're gonna move along. You clear on that, Mr. Johnson?
Yes, Chief.
Okay. So as we continue the frontal crash, we spoke about some of the already. You must evaluate the supplemental restraint system. You must, you will really see that, or you will, yes or no, because you are gonna use that also. We said that if the person has restraint in place, it will help reduce the amount of force they're gonna apply to it. So if you can have that index of suspicion, if they said, then you know say they're gonna sustain more injuries. Question is, seatbelts and airbags are effective in preventing a second collision inside the motor. So you're gonna help them with their second collision and also with the third collision. All right, because we say the seatbelt gonna slow them the time they take. It's gonna increase the time it takes for whatever object in the vehicle, and if it slows it down, then it's gonna limit the amount of force applied to them. That's what is happening from the Newton law. So when we talk about force, we say force is mass times acceleration. Make sure you remember that format. So force is mass times acceleration. But the acceleration is not the problem per se, but is when there's a change in the acceleration. So we say if the vehicle is going at 30 miles per hour and it continues at 30 miles per hour indefinitely, then there's nothing wrong with the kinetic energy. It's remain there as kinetic energy. It's not gonna change the working energy to cause any damage. But the mere fact that you're gonna change the acceleration or you're gonna decelerate and slow down, that's where the problem is. And the problem is not that you slow down, but it's the time you take to slow down or stop. So if you stop within a short time, then you're gonna have more energy being converted to working energy. And if you had slow down slower, It's converting the working energy, but not energy that can cause damage because it's dissipated. If you're breaking the vehicle, it's gonna dissipate into heat and friction, less energy left to damage the vehicle or damage the person inside the vehicle. So seatbelt help prevent that amount of energy that will be left to injure the person. And also it says the airbags decrease the severity of deceleration injuries and decrease injury to chest, face, and head. So the same thing we're saying, the airbag gonna deploy and slow down the time you take to hit the dashboard and maybe prevent you from actually hitting the dashboard or the steering wheel or the windscreen. So it's gonna prevent that second collision, and also it's gonna slow down the time it takes to the brake hit the skull and stop. So it's also gonna help with the third collision. So overall, it's gonna help reduce the injury that you get from those collisions. So it's very important. But just bear in mind, we said also that it's gonna drop the area of contact. So not only it reduce the time or increase the time it takes for you to reach the object that you would hit in the vehicle, but it also gonna increase the area of contact to the body. So instead of you just hitting a little steering wheel, the broad airbag will deploy and cushion your whole body. So it's gonna spread out the force around your body, so it's less concentrated to cause that amount of damage or injury. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, sir. With the safety mechanism then were installed in our vehicles, eh?
Yes.
You mentioned them limit the amount of time or the distance with time with collision or for the force act upon collision.
Yes.
All right. So the body parts would have a shorter distance to cover in the collision, right?
Yes.
All right. So with the force where act upon the collision with the extent of the injury now, so it would have minimized the extent of the injury.
Yes, that's what we are saying, Mr. Johnson.
All right, good.
So remember that the body we say gonna be moving at the same speed as the vehicle, and it's gonna come to a stop when some force act upon it. That's Newton's first law. So the force gonna act upon it is when the body hit either the steering wheel, the dashboard with the knee, the head hitting the roof, or the windscreen. So if it hit at the same time as when the vehicle come to a stop, from 30 to 0 within less than a second, then all that kinetic energy of the body will be transferred to working energy to cause injury to the body. But if you can slow down the time, increase the time it takes for the body to go and hit the steering wheel, then it's gonna reduce the amount of kinetic energy that is left to convert to working energy to cause damage, injury to the body. So that's the principle that you need to understand and get. But ultimately, it's your index of suspicion that you're gonna use from your mechanism of injury. So everything gonna surround your mechanism of injury, damage that is to the vehicle, damage inside of the vehicle, both inside and outside, and then injury that you're gonna see to the patient, and then you're gonna have that index of suspicion that not only the external injury that I see is possible, but there can be internal injury. All right, as we move along, okay, Mr. Johnson. So
Is there,
we also,
sir,
yes,
is there anything in a none of the Newton law them we have to do with forces where remain constant, like where you can't change?
all right. The three laws. The first law is about object in motion, remain in motion. Object at rest remain at rest. So that's dealing with their first, second, and third collision. The second one is telling you that force equal mass times acceleration. So that is speaking to the amount of force that is gonna be used to damage the vehicle and also gonna be acting upon the body. And also the third law is saying that every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So those are speaking definitely to about the injury that can occur. But the first law state that the object will remain stationary until some force. So the potential energy is gonna be there remaining and nothing will happen until some force act upon it. The thing that is moving will remain in motion. So if the car is driving and it have enough gas, you can continue driving around and nothing with that energy. So those are the laws as it applies. So that's the concept. But ultimately they are saying once you're gonna change the energy from one form to the next, it cannot be destroyed. It will never be destroyed. So it have to be converted to something. And that's where we have to understand that if it have kinetic energy during its motion or an object is falling, then when the thing come to a stop, that potential energy change to kinetic energy and eventually gonna convert it to working energy, and the working energy gonna be converted into something, and ultimately, depending on how it happened, then that's where the damage and injury will occur. So that's what you need to recognize as we are looking at trauma and as we are gonna be looking at the trauma emergencies, and as you go in the field, that is gonna be your focus. So make sure you understand the mechanism of injury and as it relates to those laws and the three collisions. All right, so it says here that despite airbags suspect injury, and we mentioned that before, so extremities resulting from the second collision, internal organs resulting from the third collision. So we are not saying that the airbag and the seat belt is gonna prevent all injuries, but what we are saying is that proper use of them will minimize the extent of the injury. So that is a key point. So it's more beneficial to have them used properly and not having them any at all. So we're gonna move along. So as it relates to children, we know that children are shorter. Well, let's say children shorter than 4 feet 9 inches should ride in the rear seat, because when that airbag deployed, it's gonna be basically covering them and can extend force on them. So in a pickup truck or single-seated vehicle, the airbag should be turned off. So that's what we are saying. This airbag can become a hazard to those population. So children, shorter ones, because of their height in that front, the airbag gonna be deploying over their head basically. So that's the danger there. So that's what they are saying. They should be in the rear seat and they should be positioned in their car seat facing back, so rear facing. All right. So remember that if the airbag did not inflate during the accident, it may deploy during execution, and we mentioned that already. So just remember that. So if the child was in the front and you go on the scene, just remember that it is likely that they can sustain injury from the airbag itself. That should have been a protective mechanism. More injury they can sustain than it would have applied to an adult. So these are some considerations that you need to take into consideration. All right, as we move along. So remember that supplemental restraint system can cause harm, and we mentioned that already, whether they are used properly or improperly. So remember that, but at the same time, so you see a person with the contusion from the seat belt, but can be there from the seat belt, but at the same time, it could have be from forces that can be extended inside. But just the fact that the seat belt is there, it can have contusion, which would have prevented the person from a worse injury if they did not have on. So bear that in mind. So we mentioned it also that you should look for contact points between the patient and the vehicle as you perform a simple quick evaluation of the interior of the vehicle. So as you go on the scene, you should be able to just quickly take a glance inside the vehicle, see what is going on there, because that will help you in your mechanism of injury and your index of suspicion. Again, I said a lot of times we go on scene and we don't really have time to focus on that. That should be a part of our assessment. You should be looking at the overall mechanism of injury, not only from the outside of the vehicle, but also from the inside. And it comes with practice and experience. And these are what you will have to develop. So you must know the fundamentals and be able to apply them as you go along. So it's all about making sure you get what you should be doing. Once you understand it, then you'll be in a better position to follow it. But if you don't get the concept, then you'll be at a loss. So for rear end crashes, we mentioned the main type of injury you're gonna have is the whiplash. And so if it's gonna be worse if you did not have any headrest. The person didn't have a headrest, then it's gonna be more damage they can have from that whiplash type of injury. And we said this from the rear end, the force applied to the rear of the vehicle gonna cause the person's body to move forward, and the head and neck gonna be lagging behind, and it's gonna be whipped against the back. And if there's not a headrest to absorb the motion, then you can have more injury sustained. And so that's gonna be one of your big concern. Even if the person does any other injury, you know that from that force and that mechanism of injury, it can sustain a spinal injury. So you make sure you treat them accordingly. And those patients, once they are stable, then that's where your KED would come into place, your Kendrick execution device. Stable patient, you have the mechanism of injury and suspect spinal injury, then it is our duty to provide that manual stabilization, protect them spine, and that's where you indicated to use your Kendrick execution device. And you who have not been aware of it, you will know more about that. So as the body is propelled forward, the head and neck are left behind, and so acceleration type injury to the brain is possible. Third collision of the brain within the skull. So we talk about the Newton's first law. It says object in motion will remain in motion until acted upon by a force. So the body going forward, the head is lagging behind. It's also gonna cause the brain to be moving same way until it's gonna come to rest against. If the headrest is there, it stop it earlier. If no headrest, then it's gonna keep going back further until. So that is again where you have the same contra coup injury, because you're gonna have compression injury to the posterior region, and the anterior portion of the brain now will be the part that is teared in that whiplash. So bear that in mind. That's a consideration. You might not see any external injury, but you must know from the mechanism of injury of a rear end collision, whiplash is likely suspect spinal injury. Or even if the person may not complain of any pain, you don't know for sure. In the field, we cannot verify and determine exactly if spinal injury is there, yes or no. Our job is to think the worst, suspect it is there, fully mobilize the patient and take them in at the hospital. Persons who are more trained than us can do a more definitive check, and they will rule it out and tell you to remove the patient, or you go back for your equipment. Lateral crashes, our concern there, like I said, you can also have whiplash injury because it's lateral, same mechanism as the rear end. The body can be propelled sideways and the head gonna be left behind to the side of the impact, and so they can have same whiplash along with same head injury, torso injury to the lateral aspect, pelvic, abdominal, lower extremity, all along that side to where the impact is, can be injured. Again, first, second, and third collision can cause those injuries. So be mindful of it. Look at protrusion to the side of the vehicle. Have an idea where the persons were. Also, if they had their seatbelt, they move all around in the vehicle. All of those are what you're gonna look at and have your index of suspicion. But ultimately, you're gonna be doing your assessment, first ABCs, LOC ABCs, then you would go to your rapid scan if indicated, and you'd search the body and find out what is presented to you and treat accordingly. So it says here that very common cause of death associated with motor vehicle crashes. So significant injury can occur from those lateral crashes, and so a vehicle struck from the side is usually struck above its center of gravity. It begins to rock away from the side of impact, results in passenger sustaining a lateral whiplash injury. So the same mechanism as the rear end, it can occur with the lateral impact, but not only the whiplash as you would mainly see with the lateral, with the rear, but you can have also significant multi-trauma, multi-system trauma to the body from that lateral impact. So they are also a very significant mechanism of injury that can cause significant injury to the patient. So if you see substantial intrusion into the passenger compartment, then you must suspect lateral chest and abdomen injuries on the side of the impact, possible fracture of the lower extremity, pelvic, ribs, organ damage from the third collision. So remember, multi-system trauma can result from lateral crashes. So you can't take them lightly. Don't tell yourself, say, boy, I try a frontal impact. These persons are going to have serious injuries. They can and will. So take that into consideration. Have your index of suspicion. Look at the mechanism of injury and make sure you use that as your guide. Rollover crashes. So this another big one. Large trucks and sport utility vehicles are prone to rollovers. Injuries depend on whether the passenger was restrained. Most common life-threatening event is ejection or partial ejection of the passenger from the vehicle. So rollover crashes, this is where the patient can sustain the most life-threatening or traumatic injuries, because in a rollover, the body, the patient, the person can be moving all over the vehicle, and as they move, they can be impacting in all different parts of the vehicle, and so they are very likely to have multi-system trauma, severe life-threatening injuries. Persons can be ejected, and again, they had the injury inside the vehicle, and also while they're being ejected, they can get injured, and also when they come up, they can be impacting other objects. So very significant mechanism of injury. You have to take that into consideration. Go ahead, Mr. Cameron.
Yes, sir. Prime example are the rollover crash. Like the one that went on the highway the other day, where the persons get flung out and the other kids them burn up in a vehicle. So because they never restraining the vehicle, and the person at the front more likely to be the one that will always get thrown out.
Yes. So again, once you go on a scene like that, and from the mechanism of injury, you know it's a rollover, then you're gonna tell yourself that everybody inside that vehicle can have sustained significant mechanism of injury. And verse with the ejection, that's another significant thing. So very remember that rollover are one of the most significant mechanism of, and also the rotation. So we got both of them. So with rotational crash, spins are conceptually similar rollovers. So with a rotation there, a vehicle is spinning, but it can impact at all different external, and just as the points are impacted external, persons inside the vehicle can be at different point inside the vehicle, and so they can have significant multi-system trauma. And so we have the second collision. The third collision, say the organ inside gonna be moving same until they are impacted against the interior of the body, and so significant mechanism of injury. So can also be serious unseen injuries. So both from the second collision where the force applied to the external part of the body, but also from third collision where the organs are impacted against the inside of the body. So these are what we will miss and overlook a lot of times, but you will suspect them from your index of suspicion and your knowledge of Newton's 3 laws and the 3 collision types of collision. So you should determine speed of the vehicle. We say that's a big one in terms of the amount of kinetic energy. If you double the speed of the vehicle, you're gonna be quadrupling, or the kinetic energy will be 4 times. That's how significant the speed is. If you double the weight of the vehicle, you only double the kinetic energy. So the amount of kinetic energy, which ultimately gonna be converted into the working energy, is directly related to the speed of the vehicle. That's why they say speed kills. But as we recognize, is not say that the speed kills, but is the change in the velocity, the rapid change, is what is gonna create that energy to cause the amount of damage. So if you gradually slow down, then that energy, working energy, would have been converted to braking and heat and sound. You hear the screeching of the brake, but you will have so much to cause damage and act upon the body. So whether the patient was struck and pulled under the vehicle is also apparent. Hold on here. Let's just look back on that. So remember, importantly, to consider that rotational and rollover crashes are very significant. So Miss Wellington, what is the main injury you'd expect from a rear end collision? Miss Wellington.
Sir, the main type of injury would be whiplash. Whiplash, sir. Sir, are you hearing?
Yes. And how does that person sustain the whiplash?
Sir, from the force, sir. The force of how. Sir?
Yeah, how do you explain how the whiplash occur?
Hello?
Explain to me how that whiplash would occur.
Sir, the whiplash would be occur by the force of how fast the vehicle is going, that the person is traveling in, and if there are if there's no security, sir, like with a seatbelt.
Okay, remember we're talking about a rear end collision. So who can help Miss Wellington with that part of the question? Explain to me how the whiplash occur in the rear end collision. Miss Rochelle. Hold on, Mr. Wilson. Miss Rochelle, can you finish that part of the question?
Sir, the whiplash happened because because of the added force of the other vehicle that's in the collision. The injury that's more susceptible to that type of collision would be spinal injury.
Okay,
was that the question? Did I answer the question?
Not directly. The answer I expect to get is that a whiplash occurs because the rear end collision, the force applied to the rear of the vehicle cause the body to move forward, and we say that the head and neck is left behind, so you have an opposing force. So the body going forward, the head and neck left behind, and if there's not a headrest, it's gonna be extending further behind and cause that whiplash. That's how the spine can become damaged from a rear end collision. You have to understand the mechanism. We are teaching you fundamental things here. The more you can understand the fundamental, you can appreciate what is happening to your patient when you go out there and see these mechanisms. So you have to understand it, and the question can come up in all right, so we're coming up close to a break, but let's just see. Finish. Go ahead, Mr. Cameron.
Yes, sir. Johnson. Hello? Hello?
Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, Chief. All right. So, when I say the force acting upon an object in motion, you see? So, if you're moving and something is to hit you from behind, right? And you could see that the other vehicle is about to hit you, and you accelerate and minimize the collision instead of stopping to have a sudden impact. That can minimize the amount of injury on the spine and the lower extremity, and also the brain.
Yes, that's correct. If you can afford to do that.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Because the acceleration remains constant. Once you decrease it, that will cause the collision. So the force will be greater.
Yes, and the speed at which the vehicle that you is coming at also.
All
so
right.
if you can reduce it, it's good. All right. So moving on. With car versus pedestrian, injuries are often graphic and apparent, but can also be unseen injuries, I guess, like we said, from the third collision. So you should determine, if you can, the speed at which the vehicle is going, and that will give you an index of suspicion of the amount of kinetic energy and work involved to damage the vehicle and also damage the pedestrian. So whether the patient was thrown through the air, whether the patient was struck and pulled under the vehicle, these are all mechanisms that you will look at to determine the extent of the injuries possible or likely and guide you as you go forward. Very important, especially when it comes on to age, because of their shorter frame, their impact point will be different, and so they can have more significant than a adult. So you have to look at your mechanism of injury and the population you are dealing with. So evaluate the vehicles that struck the patient for structural damage. A ALS backup should be summoned for any patient who have sustained a significant mechanism of injury. So again, the mechanism of injury, once it's significant, you're gonna be suspecting multi-system trauma, and so you're gonna assess accordingly and call for your backup. Again, like we say, in Jamaica setting, you might not have any ALS backup coming, so you have to make sure you do what you can within the time frame and package that patient to get them to where the ALS assistance will be. So it's very important. Car versus bicycle, evaluate like you would for a car versus pedestrian. So same patient, or just that the person is now on a bicycle, so they can be impacted directly by the vehicle. The bicycle can get impact, and they can also be thrown, and they can be even impacted by the bicycle also. So it's very important that you look at the mechanism of injury, and also whether the person had a helmet or not. That will give you an idea of the injury they can sustain, and also look at the helmet to see if it has been damaged. If the force extend to damage the helmet, then tell yourself that that force also apply to the skull and also to the organ inside. So always think about your first, second, and third collision, and suspect, have that index of suspicion as you go forward. So presume that the patient has sustained an injury to the spinal column or spinal cord until proven otherwise at the hospital. So we said from before that car versus bicycle, car versus pedestrian, these are significant mechanisms of injury. So always think the worst possible scenario, and that is including spinal injury. So you take your precaution. All right, so we will break here and resume at 10:45, and we will complete this chapter by lunchtime. All right, so 10:45. Welcome back. So we're continue with the last section of blunt trauma, and we are looking at car versus motorcycle. So this is another area that we can consider as significant mechanism of injury, and persons will usually have helmet as protection. Some cyclists nowadays have leather and abrasion resistant clothing, and this was started from the professional riders, and they will have boots. But bear in mind that these protection are there mainly to prevent road rash or abrasive injuries when they are thrown and slid along the road. It's not there to prevent them from getting injured if they collide in another vehicle or is crushed against any object. That's not what these protection offer. So collision usually occur against larger vehicles or stationary objects, and these form of protection that the bikers would have is not going to prevent them from sustaining serious injuries in those type of collision. So bear that in mind when you look at the mechanism of injury for car versus motorcycle. So again, they can have significant multi-system trauma, especially they are ejected from the vehicle or flung from the bike. They are gonna be the knee can or the femur can impact the handlebar. You can have bilateral femur fractures. When they impact the ground, they can have further multi-system trauma depending on the object they fall on and whether they are thrown against another vehicle or crushed. And so your index of suspicion should be there that they can have significant injuries. So it's another form of significant mechanism of injury, and also significant injuries can occur. So when assessing the scene, look for deformity of the motorcycle, side of most damage, distance of skid in the road, deformity of stationary objects or other vehicles, extent and location of deformity in the helmet. So it's very important that you consider these things as your mechanism of injury and also your suspicion of the underlying or possible injuries that these motorcyclists can sustain. So it's very important that all along you're going to be considering your mechanism of injury. So if you are hearing me, raise your hand. Okay. All right. So with car versus motorcycle crashes, you can have head-on crash, angular crash, and with a head-on crash, we said that the motorcycle strike another object and stops it forward motion while the rider continues moving forward. So we see the same three collisions coming up. That is likely. So collision one, the vehicle. Can you hear me now, Miss Rochelle? Can the others hear me? Raise your hand if you can hear me. Are you here? Okay. So far, you had a question. Okay, thank you. So for a angle, as the word suggests, force will be applied at an angle. Collision is not a direct head, but actually at an angle. So the motorcycle strikes an object at an so that the rider sustains the crushing injuries to the lower extremity. The person will be coming along and the vehicle motorbike get out of control and they are thrown to the ground and they are still along the ground to another motor vehicle or it's object they get in contact and so they get serious injuries even with an angular curve. So again, they say that motorcyclists will, at the point of collision, they will do what they call lay down the bike to try to get themselves out from where the impact will be. So they put themselves on the other side and try to minimize the injury that they will sustain. But most of the times, it's the professional riders that can do that. The average rider will try to do that, and that will minimize the injury potential. If you are still seeing my slide, raise your hand. Are you still seeing? Raise your hand.